Thank you so much for coming, Ehud. It's a pleasure to have you here with us in Madrid. This is the first event of the Jewish-Islamic Resonances lecture series that I will be organizing throughout the next 2 years within the framework of my Kabbalah Philosophy and Power Marie Curie project. And so it's a huge pleasure, both intellectually and personally speaking, for me to have Ehud here with us. Who is coming from the Ben Gurion University of the Negev in Israel. He's a scholar specializing in medieval Judeo-Arabic literature and thought. He has held visiting scholar positions at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and also at the University of Pennsylvania, Hamburg, Michigan, and Harvard. He's the author of several works, including God's Chosen People, Yehuda Levi's Kusari, and the Shi Imam Doctrine. I have here 2 of the books for those over here. So you can see them. And some amazing articles, mostly about like the cross-pollinations and synergies between Jewish and Islamic, mostly Shia Islamic thought, as for example, my 2 favorites, I will just name them, Galut and Gaiva, The Exile of Israel and the Occultation of the Shi Imam Messiah, a comparative study of Yehuda Levi and early Imami Shi writers, which has been published in the Jerusalem Studies in Arabic and Islam Journal, and Directions in Jewish Shi Studies published in the Shi Studies Review. He's currently working together with Professor Daniel Lasker on a project titled The Renunciant Pious Stream in Early Islam and its imprint on medieval Judeo-Arabic thought. So he will be talking actually about Zuhd, asceticism, and its influence on Baḥya ibn Paqūda. As I said, for me, it's a huge honor. I always wanted to invite Ehud. We have been in touch for many, many years throughout the many different countries in which I have lived. So welcome once again, and please come in.
Hello. I'm grateful to you, all the ones who came here physically and the one who are with us in Zoom. And I'm grateful, of course, to Lucas for the invitation and to Lucas and his family for the wonderful hospitality that they showed to me. As a member of the as a member of the people of the book, I read Ahl al-Kitab. I for 20 years and more actually read only one book, which is the book of the Kuzari of Judah Levi. But in the last year, I added another book to my list of reading, which is Duties of the Heart of Baḥya ibn Paqūda. But I'm still reading the Kuzari, so I'm still a member of Ahl al-Kitab, loyal to it. But here I'm actually presenting something new, which I haven't published yet anything about. Maybe soon there will be a tiny part of it will be published. So it's really a very nice occasion for me to introduce some of my findings of my research in the last years. We have in our disposal only few direct and indirect pieces of evidence regarding the time of Baḥya ibn Paqūda, and the only treatise of his known to us. Actually, we have so little evidence we don't know how to pronounce his first name exactly. Baḥya is a good guess, maybe. But yeah, the important thing about is his work. So his work, Al-Hidayah ila Faraid al-Qulub, the direction or the guidance to the duties of the heart. As I don't have the time to present to you here this evidence, I will only say that it buttresses the assumption that the Hidayah was written during the later part of the period of the party king. that is more or less the second half of the 11th century, before the emergence of the Almoravites. Not working. Maybe I will.
No, but they are not connected. Huh? They are not connected. Like this is just for Zoom.
Why is not?
Wait.
Need it all the time. No. No. Okay. So, okay. Based on this same thin body of evidence, we can conclude that Ibn Paqūda, we call him here Ibn Paqūda to be on the safe side, who served as a judge, Dayan, in the Jewish community of Zaragoza, was active in this city shortly after, and perhaps already during the time that two other Jewish luminaries, the grammarian and physician Jonah Abul Walid Ibn Janah, Ariel is happy, and the poet Solomon Abu Ayyub Ibn Gabirol. So Lucas is happy we are mentioning his favorite, Ibn Gabirol, were active in this major Andalusi city. I also don't have the time here to present to you with information regarding the editions of Al-Hidayah and its translations. For those who read Arabic, but do not read Arabic in Hebrew characters, I will refer here to Abraham's Shalom Yehuda's edition, in which the Hebrew script of the Judeo-Arabic and in the manuscript is transliterated to Arabic script. Yeah, but you should be aware that in its Hebrew translation, medieval Hebrew translation made by Judah ibn Tibon in the second half of the 12th century, under the title Torat Chobot HaLevavot, this work became immensely influential and readable through the ages. And since the end of the 15th century, it's appeared in hundreds of editions. And it's a Jewish classic. In my lecture, as my lecture is related to the subject of the Muslim background of Ibn Paqūda's work, it can be instructive to cite what did some of the serious scholars had to say about it, about the Muslim background. So you see the list here of the 4 scholars that I'm about to cite, and the name and the dates of the books that I'm citing from. So we start from Martin Schreiner. Among the works of Arabic literature that influenced the author of Duties of the Heart, one part has so far remained unconsidered, which appears to have been of a particular importance for the creation of Duties of the Heart, and from which Baḥya may have received the initial inspiration for composing his work. These are the Mohammedan ascetic Zuhd writings. So we move to Georges Vaida. His quote, by studying the ascetic doctrine of Baḥya, we were able to discern the presence of 3 or even 4 different inspirations, that of Muslim Zuhd, with certain elements of Mu'tazilite thought, and that of Platonist philosophy, and that of Rabbinic Judaism. And we are passing now to contemporary scholarship, starting with Paul Fenton. Baḥya ibn Paqūda, in whose Arabic work, The Duties of the Heart, the teaching of Sufism play a preponderant part. Baḥya composed an individualistic spiritual theology based almost entirely on Sufi pietistic manuals. And the last one, and the most recent, is Sarah Sviri. Indeed, to the best of my knowledge, the first work to have appeared in al-Andalus, which can be qualified as Sufi, was a book in Judeo-Arabic titled Al-Hidayah ila Faraid al-Qulub. It was written by Ibn Hazm's Jewish contemporary, Baḥya ibn Paqūda. Yeah, Ibn Hazm is about a generation older, probably, than Baḥya, but still can be counted as a contemporary. What we can learn from the above-cited passages is that scholars of previous generations, Schreiner and Weida, brought forth the assessment that identified Zuhd as the main, if not the main, background of al-Hidayah. However, in contemporary scholarship, this assessment was abandoned and replaced by a confident assessment that identified Sufism as the main inspiration for Baḥya's work. This change culminated in Diana Zlobel's 2006 monograph titled A Sufi-Jewish Dialogue, Philosophy and Mysticism in Baḥya ibn Paqūda's Duties of the Heart. The fading out of Zuhd and its replacement with Sufi background reflects the developments in the academic world, where until recently the study of Sufism eclipsed the study of Zuhd. Scholars' disregard of the study of Zuhd, treating it as a mere prelude to Sufism, if treating it at all, led to many misconceptions and mistakes. In the last few decades, the study of Zuhd started to emerge out of the shadow of the study of Sufism, mainly by the efforts of Christopher Melchert. Melchert's book, Before Sufism, Early Islamic Renunciants' Piety, was published recently in 2020 and seems to be the first monograph to approach Zuhd in a critical historical manner. Building on such serious academic efforts, my aim is to shift the assessment regarding al-Hidayah's sources in Islamic culture back to the Zuhd direction. My presentation, now we move from the introduction to the body of the lecture. My presentation dedicated to this subject will be divided into three parts. The first part is devoted to the characteristics of Zuhd and its representation in early Islamic literature. The second part is devoted to different aspects of the representation of Zuhd in al-Hidayah. The third part is devoted to the Andalusi context of the subject under discussion. So you have to be patient until I reach al-Andalus. So we start with the question, what is Zuhd? Zuhd is an early Islamic trend. Its beginnings might be traced back to the first century of the Islamic period, that is the 7th century AD, yet it was fully developed and made its decisive impact on Muslim culture and society during the second and the third, I say the first half of the 3rd century Hijri, 18th, 19th century AD. Thus, Zuhd preceded Sufism, which only came to age in the 3rd, 4th centuries, I will say second half of the 9th century is the time that we really have some considerable amount of Sufi writings. And before that, we almost have nothing. There is an interesting difference between the way the Zuhad, single is Zahid or Zahida, the practitioners of Zuhd situate themselves in the historical continuum and in the way their trend should be, and the way the trend should be depicted historically. The Zuhad of the Muslim age depicted themselves as standing on a line of Zuhad, which started with the virtuous persons such as Adam and Noah, and continue with the prophet of the ancient people of Israel. David appears in Zuhd tradition as the great repentant. Among the figures of early Christianity, Jesus is portrayed in this tradition as the Zahid per excellence. The Muslim Zuhad also expressed admiration to the Christian ascetics of their time. Nevertheless, from the historical perspective, Zuhd is a distinct phenomenon. As such, it exhibited special features that set it apart from Christian asceticism as well as from other historical manifestations of asceticism. We will gain a better understanding of Zuhd, depicting it not as an ascetic trend, listen carefully, Lucas, but as a trend of renunciate piety. Many of the Zuhad did their best to conceal their extraordinary acts of devotion and even internalize it altogether. In the Zuhd praxis in general, the latent aspects of intention that motivate the action was considered to be more important than the aspect of the execution of devotional acts. So we start with Zuhd as an attitude. Zuhd as an attitude revolves around the opposition and tension between two realities or stages in human life. The reality of the present world, ad-dunya, and the reality of the next world, al-akhirah. These two worlds are depicted as excluding one another. As a result, the Zuhad as the one who aspires to secure his or her place in the next world must turn away from the present world. The Zuhd motto, the renunciation of the present world, Zuhd fi dunya, is sometimes supplemented by the saying, and the passion for the next world, al-gharbah fil akhirah. Consequently, the Zahid and the Zahida must judge each of his or her thoughts and acts from the perspective of the next world, which is their true destination and permanent place of dwelling, and not from the perspective of his or her temporary, misleading, an elusive place of dwelling in the present world. The Zuhad cannot come to terms with their life in the present world by perceive it just as a test or a prelude to the life of the next world. By their constant awareness of death and its implication, Zikr al-Maut, they aspire to be counted already here and now among the people of the next world, Abna al-Akhirah, and not among the people of the present world, Abna ad-Dunya. Now we came to the very important, in my mind, feature of Zuhd as a private religion. From the angle of comparative study of religion, it seems to me that the most fertile assessment of Zuhd can be reached not by treating it as a manifestation of asceticism in Islam, but by evaluating it as the embodiment of the private religion in early Islam period. Evaluating Zuhd as a private religion is based, among other, on the following Zuhd features. Individual responsibility. In Zuhd, the meaningful axis of religion is the one that runs between God and the individual. The believer is standing by himself alone before God as all-knowing and constant observer. God observes and evaluates each of the individual intents and deeds. From his side, the individual believer is judged directly by God and is accountable to him without the mediation of intermediate agents such as prophets, saints, and communities. Thus, the individual believer holds a complete responsibility for his or her fate and attainment of salvation or punishment in the next world. Non-normative informal way of worship. In general, the Zuhad did not separate themselves in a permanent and visible manner from the general Muslim society. Most of them continued to reside in Muslim communities, saw themselves obliged to the duties of the normative religion, and participate in public worship. Nevertheless, the Zuhad could not satisfy themselves only by fulfilling the duties of the normative religion. For them, the thrust of the worship of God lied not in its normative part, but in its additional non-normative part. The practices of the normative public religion are formulated according to fixed quota and precise procedures that should be implemented by everyone in the community in the same manner. Contrary to this, early Zuhd practices were defined by each practitioner according to his or her inclinations and inner call. As such, those practices may have differed greatly from practitioner to practitioner and did not follow any specific formulation. Absence of institution, the term that I'm using here is too long for reading. As the realm of Zuhd is private one, the Zuhad did not see any need to unite or create any specific establishment for themselves. Thus, there were hardly any signs of institution building among them. One became a Zaid or a Zaida by his own initiative, Mubadara. No preparation and no training are required. The Zuhad teach by self-example and by giving advice when asked for it. As a result, contrary to Sufism, no formal teacher-novice relations and the institutions attached to it were established in the realm of Zuhd. So we are moving now to speak about the literature of Zuhd. During his heyday in the second and the third Islamic centuries, in the eastern part of the Islamic world, Zuhd was already distinguished by its own literature in different genres. Traditional, so the first one and the basic one, traditional books of Zuhd, the basic layer of Zuhd literature are books of Zuhd, Kutub az-Zuhd, in the form of tradition hadith, compiled by compilers who belongs to the proto-Sunni stream of the people of tradition, Ahl al-Hadith. The earliest example of this genre to have reached us, in part or complete, are the books of Zuhd of the following compilers. I won't read their names. You can see it on the slide here. You may understand that some of them were the eminent personalities of the Ahl al-Hadith, like Abdallah ibn al-Mubarak and Waki ibn Jarrah, and of course Ahmad ibn Hanbal. Second is non-traditionalist work of Zuhd. Early Zuhd literature found its expression not only in hadith, but in other forms as well. In the numerous writings of Al-Haris al-Muhasibi, most notably in his book of Observance of the Rights of God, Kitab al-Ri'aya ila Hukuk Allah, al-Muhasibi presented the Renaissance world view in an ordered methodological manner, one which go way behind the traditionalist format. Al-Muhasibi, who is identified by the inner procedure of the self-reckoning, muhasabat an-nafs, that's why he is called Al-Muhasibi, was the main formulator of the inward internalized type of Zuhd. This type focuses on the motives behind the worshipper's acts, not on the acts themselves. Put it differently, the inner side of religious life is more important than the outer side. Al-Muhasibi's way of writing and thinking was a major inspiration for Ibn Paqūda. The main aspects of Al-Muhasibi's writings, his style, his terminology, and his psychological inclined type of Zuhd is present abundantly in Al-Hidayah. And also should be mentioned is Zuhd poetry. Early Zuhd found its poetic expression in the genre of Zuhdiyat. The leading representative of this genre was the Abbasid poet Abu al-Atahiyya. I'm not, because I'm not a scholar of poetry, I'm not focusing on this side, but it's also very important, and actually studying the way that Jewish poets were actually influenced by Zuhd. Poetry is also a wide field for discovery. We are moving to the subject of the infiltration of Zuhd material to different sorts of Islamic literature. Behind its own unique literary expression, different corpora from a variety of trends and denominations of early Islam dedicated sections to Zuhd traditions. So the first one is the Sunni or Sunni in the making hadith compilations, such as the Musnad of Ibn Abi No, you need to. No. You can, okay, that's one. You can see I won't read it right because, but you can see some of the major works in early Hadith have the sections of Zuhd in them, sometimes really significant sections. And also Shi Hadith. Early Shi traditionalists incorporated and appropriated Zuhd material into their works. They put into the mouths of their imams, saying that were ascribed in the Zuhd literature to early Zuhad. We find this procedure in the work that I'm showing you here. There is one early Kutub Zuhd by a Shi writer, and also much material in the first of the fourth canonical book of the Shi Hadith, Al-Kafi by Al-Kulaini. And we move to Adab compilation. Sections of Zuhd traditions and pieces of poetry, Zuhdiyat, were included in major early Adab compilations. And you see that I named here 4, which are the 4 major early Adab compilations, including Al-Aqd al-Farid, which is an Andalus work. All of them have sections dedicated to Zuhd. And even more importantly is the Adab, the Baghdadi courtier and man of letters, Ibn Abi Dunya. He compiled, among others, many monographs dedicated to Zuhd subject. You can see very few of them. I just named few of them presented to you here, his monographs. The inclusion of a wealth of Zuhd material in Adab works, first and foremost in Ibn Abi Dunya's monograph, is of a special importance from the Jewish perspective. For educated Andalusi Jews who seek to take part in the cultural society and culture of their time and place, reading Adab literature was a must. So even if you say someone like Baḥya and other Jews educated Jews of the time did not read all this Hadith literature, Sunni or Shi, but they must encountered it in reading Adab work, and we know for sure that they read the Adab works. And last, and maybe in this could be also the least in our subject, not of course very important as well, Sufi literature. Sufi literature of the late 10th century and the first half of the 11th century, that is before Baḥya's time. Most importantly, the compilations by the following writers. We can add to it also Sulami works. Sulami, the great historiographer of the early Sufism. All of those works exhibited clear signs of appropriations of earlier Zuhd heritage. In this literature, notable Zuhad are portrayed as the progenitors of Sufism. Zuhd terms, conceptions, and traditions are used abundantly, but their original use is transformed significantly by its placement in the setting of Sufi mystical framework of the station, maqamat, and states Ahwal doctrine, Sufi doctrine. A main exception to this rule is Abu Nu'aym al-Isfahani. That's why I separated him a bit from the rest here in the slide. He reconstructed faithfully Zuhd traditions and materials while adding to it, at the last part of his work, the Hilyat al-Alawiyya, traditions and materials related to later Sufi personalities. So we move to the second part of the lecture. Signs of Zuhd in al-Hidayah. The signs of Zuhd in al-Hidayah are manifold. Far from exhausting this subject, in the framework of this lecture, I will provide you with examples that illustrates the impact of Zuhd on Ibn Paqūda's thought. So we start with the terminology. Throughout the book, Ibn Paqūda is using a wide variety of terms and expressions stemming from Zuhd literature. The Zuhd motto, which I already mentioned, the renunciation of the present world, appears in the book no less than 20 times. And the term Zuhd himself appears many times, and a whole part of the book, part 9, is dedicated directly to it. Well, just going back to the right slide before moving ahead. Other Zuhd terms are indicated in the headlines of parts 4 to 10. That is a 7 chapter. We all avoid it. 7 chapters out of the 10 chapters of the work of Al-Hidayah: reliance, purifying the acts, humility, repentance, self-reckoning, and the true love of God. The way in which Ibn Paqūda deals with those terms in these parts are akin to Zuhd literature. So here I will add, you can see, few other interesting and important Zuhd terms and expressions that are used in the Al-Hidayah. There are many more, but I found those one really interesting and representative. So now we move to the absence of Sufi terminology from Al-Hidayah. So all this, what I present to you here on Sufi terminology is missing from Al-Hidayah. Don't be confused to think that it is in the Al-Hidayah. It's not there. It isn't there, yeah? Had Al-Hidayah been a work closely related to Sufism, as scholars of the last generation deem it to be, we would expected it to include all those familiar terms that are unique to the Sufi tradition. but they are not there. But if someone objects and say, of course, there is so many, no, here, where are you? Yeah, this is the right slide. So if someone objects and say, wow, we have terms in the Hidayah that are included in Sufi literature, and okay, this one I don't have. Like if someone objects and say, just a minute. We have also other terms like halwa and other terms that are very much applied by Sufi writers, but all of those terms, including the one that I showed you in the previous slides here, all of them are actually stemming from Zuhd literature and were adapted by Sufi literature. There we know. Now we are moving to to anonymous Zuhd oriented saying and anecdotes in the Al-Hidayah. So another good indicator for the balance, or rather the imbalance between Zuhd and Sufism in the background of Al-Hidayah can be found in 90 or so anonymous saying and anecdotes from non-Jewish sources, that is Muslim sources actually, that mostly, that Ibn Paqūda inserted throughout his work. Many of these anonymous sayings and anecdotes are distinguished by the Zuhd content, and some of those can be tracked down to the earliest books of Zuhd that are available to us. For example, two sayings that can be tracked down to Ibn al-Mubarak's Kitab az-Zuhd. The first one, the first one is this. I will read it. It was said that this world and the next, ad-dunya wal-akhirah, are like two wives of the same man. When you please one, you necessarily anger the other. This saying expresses in a tangible manner Zuhd's basic assumption that caring for the present world and caring for the next world are incompatible. And another saying, according to the saying of one of those who put their trust in God, quote, I never started a day in any condition such that I wished I were in some other. This saying reflects Zuhd's attitude of indifference toward everything that occurs to you in the present world. The Arabic term is istiwa. Other sayings that appears in Al-Hidayah are attested in sections dedicated to Zuhd in early Adab compilations, such as Ibn Qutayba's Uyun al-Ahbar, or the comprehensive Zuhd monograph Zam ad-Dunya by Ibn Abi Dunya. Look at the following examples. One wise man said in this respect, whoever renounces the present world for the present world's sake is like one who extinguishes fire with straw. And another one, it was already said by one of the wise men, as fire and water cannot dwell together in one vessel, so also the love of the present world and the love of the next cannot dwell together in the heart of the believer. And now I have a surprise for you. Here is an example of Zuhd-oriented anecdote in the Hidayah, appearing in the Hidayah, attested to non-traditionalist, attested in a non-traditionalist work of Zuhd. It was told by a pious man that he met some people returning from the Great War with an enemy. He said to them, "You are returning praise to God from the smaller battle, al-Jihad al-Azhar, carrying your booty. Now prepare yourself for the greater battle, al-Jihad al-Akbar." They asked, "What is the greater battle?" And he answered, "The battle against the inclination and its armies." Why it is surprising? For years, scholars assumed that this anecdote, in its original and in its Muslim garb, is usually related to the Prophet, and usually related to the Prophet Muhammad, which, of course, Ibn Paqūda knew that it's related to Muhammad, and he call him here a pious man, which is okay for him to relate to Muhammad as a pious man, as he relates to all the other people that he knew originally, where some of them were very noble Muslims of the early period. He gave respect to all of them. So, but scholars thought that this saying or this anecdote originated in Sufi circles, who some of you probably also are aware of this. Finally, a few of them noticed that it had already appeared in Kitab al-Khalwa. It took something like 60 years. Kitab al-Khalwa was published in print in the middle of the 50s. And only about 10 years, 12 years ago, scholars started to be aware that the anecdote is appearing. This anecdote, a very famous anecdote, or tradition, of course, a prophetical tradition, is appearing in Kitab al-Khalwa, written by contemporary. Kitab al-Khalwa is ascribed to al-Muhasibi, but according to some scholars, was written by a contemporary, perhaps older contemporary of al-Muhasibi, Ahmad ibn Asim al-Antaki. In its original historical setting, this anecdote represents the approach of the adherents of the psychological type of Zuhd, who emphasize the importance of the combat against the soul, jihad al-nafs, or against the self. They stated this approach vis-a-vis those who, from Zuhd point of view, emphasized the importance of the participation in a military expeditions against non-Muslims. So the background of this famous anecdote is actually tensions between different, you can say, parties in the early Zuhd. And of course, without relating it to Zuhd and without actually studying Zuhd and understanding the diversity in Zuhd, you cannot understand really what is behind this saying. So I said that it's hard to find a Sufi terminology. I mean, Sufi specific terminology in the Hidayah, but when we are turning to Sufi oriented saying, an anecdote in Hidayah, among those 90 that I mentioned before, So Ibn Paqūda include in his work some, albeit few sayings and anecdotes that stem from Sufi sources and are non-Zuhd in their content. Intrinsically, all those Sufi quotations that in the Sufi sources are attributed to early notable Sufis such as Sahel al-Tustari and Yahya ibn Mu'adh al-Razi are centered around the figure of the Noer, al-Arif. So there is actually 4 examples. I'm bringing you here only 2. 3 of the 4 examples appear in the first part of the Al-Hidayah, which is the philosophical part dedicated to the oneness of God. So the first example, one of the knowers has said, the most knowledgeable among the people concerning God is the one among them who is the most perplexed concerning him, that is God. And the other one is the only Sufi-oriented saying which does not appear in the book, the first part, but on another part. As said one of the learned, the heart of those who knows God have eyes, for they see that the careless do not, they see what the careless do not see. This is a saying which is attributed to al-Tustari. Al-Hidayah also includes few sayings and even a whole passage that the Islamic sources attributed to Zu an-Nun al-Misri, who is considered by the Sufis as one of their pioneering figures, and is known outside the Sufi literature primarily, but is known as outside the Sufi literature and circles primarily as a Zaid. Indeed, in Ibn Paqūda's work, the saying that are connected to Zu an-Nuns are Zuhd-oriented and does not exhibit any specific Sufi characteristics. So to sum up, on the basis of the evidence from Al-Hidayah presented above, it can be concluded that Ibn Paqūda was familiar to some extent with Sufi sources. Nevertheless, his interest in specific Sufi content of those sources offered to him was narrow and limited. It certainly pales in comparison with his interest in Zuhd, and especially in his interest in the psychological inward type of Zuhd. So we are moving now to what Ibn Paqūda himself have to say about Zuhd. Unlike modern scholars, Ibn Paqūda had a keen interest in Islamic Zuhd. He knew a whole lot about it and had a deep appreciation of its nature. Thus, reading what Ibn Paqūda has to say on Zuhd is, at least for me, a rewarding experience. A dominant approach among modern scholars is the one that depicts Zuhd as the Islamic version of asceticism. Building on this understanding, some scholars distinguish between extreme asceticism and mild asceticism in Islamic Zuhd. Scholars of Ibn Paqūda use this distinction to characterize his approach as belonging to the category of mild asceticism. However, Ibn Paqūda himself, in his discussion in the chapter 3, in the part of his book dedicated directly to the topic of Zuhd, part 9, present altogether different approach regarding the essential division within Zuhd. So we start with how he presents the 3 categories of authentic Zuhd, and then we move to the categories of inauthentic Zuhd according to Ibn Paqūda. So the first category of authentic Zuhd, quote, they escaped the inhabited world completely, fleeing to the barren desert and to the wilderness of the mountains, where there is no man and no company. They eat whatever they find, like grass and leaf. They wear rags and raw woolen robes, and they dwell among the rocks. The common denominator of the manners of the practices of this category is that they are all manifest and visible. The one who practices those manners are, or part of them, is declaring himself wide open that he is a Zahid. The second category, they cut themselves off from all thoughts and luxuries, but they do not consider it proper to flee the inhabited world because the member of the group must be able to gain their necessary livelihood. Instead of going to the desert and to the mountains, they find solitude in their houses and loneliness in their own homes. What characterize this the members of this category is that instead of manifesting their detachment from the present world publicly, they prefer practicing it inside their own dwellings, where it stayed hidden from the public eye. And the third and most important category in Baḥya's terms, they renounce the present world in heart and consciousness, bikulubihim wa damirihim, but they share with the other inhabitants of the present world in its cultivation, construction, and reproduction, which they conduct in obedience with God. They have understood the form of man's trial in this present world, his states of imprisonment and strangeness in it, how the present world has snatched him away from the spiritual world, and they loathe this world and its affairs, their soul longing for the next world and awaiting death in this one. Everything that is mentioned in this description points to the fact that the manners which set apart the Zuhad who belong to this category are connected to their inner awareness. Nothing in their external behavior betrays them as different from other people. From the point of view of those who depict Zuhd as asceticism, even Paqūda's move of including the people of this category among the ranks of Zuhad is absurd. Yet, from the point of view that depicts Zuhd first and foremost as an attitude toward the present and the next world and as a private religion, the inclusion of this category among the categories of Zuhd makes perfect sense. In a private religion, the individual stands alone in front of God. So if other people are not aware of one's rejection of the present world and longing for the next, because everything that signifies it belongs to its inner realm, that can be counted as an advantage for him. For Ibn Paqūda, all above mentioned categories are equally genuine modes of practicing Zuhd. Yet according to him, the practitioners who are inclined to the third category have the advantage of belonging to the group which is, quote, closer to the way of the moderation prescribed by the law. And now to the categories of the inauthentic practitioners of Zuhd, as Zuhad al-Mutazaidin. So let's ask ourselves, why is it that according to Ibn Paqūda, the authentic practitioners of Zuhd split among themselves regarding the right way to express their renunciation of the present world? Why is it that not all of them share the visible ways that were common among the ascetics? Why is it that some of them limit their renunciation practices to their own homes, and others choose to withdraw from the present world in their inner dimension only? Ibn Paqūda tackled those questions by supplementing his list of 3 categories of authentic Zuhd practitioners with the list of 3 categories of inauthentic practitioners of Zuhd. Whereas among the authentic practitioners of Zuhd, the first category is characterized by its visible extrovert practices. In the case of the practitioners of inauthentic Zuhd, all 3 categories adhere to the visible extrovert practices. No, you're here. The adherence of all practitioners of inauthentic Zuhd to visible extrovert practices reveal the problem at the basis of using this kind of Zuhd practices. One's use of visible extrovert practice can be considered authentic only when his inner motivation is pure. That is, he has nothing at all to do with seeking worldly gains. Contrarily, those who use visible extrovert practices inauthentically are the ones who are motivated by seeking worldly gains of different kinds. They might receive materialistic gains from others who admire their visible pietism. According to Ibn Paqūda, such is the case of the first and the worst category of the practitioners of inauthentic Zuhd. They might find in adhering to Zuhd practices consolation for their failure to gain materialistic gains. Such is the case with the second category. Finally, there are those who might use it as a default for their inability to make materialistic gains. Such is the case of the third category. The problem here is how one can tell who is authentic and who is inauthentic practitioner of Zuhd, while their visible practices might be the same. And what distinguishes between them and the inner, because what is distinguishing between them is the inner concealed motivation only. This kind of problematic, which is very relevant to the use of the visible extrovert practices, is less relevant when the use of Zuhd practices is concealed and limited to one's own dwelling, and it's not relevant at all when the Zuhd practices are completely internalized. Thus, in his orderly methodological way, Ibn Paqūda addresses in this important chapter of Al-Hidayah the problem of the risk of the corruption of Zuhd by those who choose to practice it in outward manners. In the early Zuhd literature, we found an abundance of evidence for the awareness of this problem, as well as for the understanding of the primacy of the inner attitude over the manifest actions. These 2 factors play an important role in the emergence and the evolution of the concealed and the inward types of Zuhd alongside the outward type. Just a minute. So we move now to another important observation of Ibn Paqūda about Zuhd. This observation is related to the notion of estrangement, ghurba, and the figure of the stranger, al-gharib. Another high valuable and original contribution made by Ibn Paqūda to the understanding of Zuhd appears at the end of chapter 3 of part 8 of Al-Hidayah. This chapter is the longest in the book. It encompasses most of the issues discussed in the book and thus regarded by the author himself as a concise presentation of the whole book. So if you don't have time to read the whole Hidayah, you should read this book, which is lengthy enough, about 10% of the book. This chapter comprises no less than 30 different aspects of the self-reckoning, muhasabat al-nafs. The last of them includes a detailed discussion on the notion of estrangement, ghurba, and the figure of the stranger, gharib. Ibn Paqūda's decision to place the discussion dedicated to this topic as the 30th and last in the longest and most comprehensive chapter of his book attests to the special importance ascribed by him to the notion of estrangement and the figure of the stranger. The figure of the stranger is a cherished figure in the Zuhd tradition. It is not hard to understand why. The practitioners of Zuhd who aspire to be counted already here and now as the people of the next world, of Nile Akhirah, depicted themselves as strangers among the people of the present world, Abna al-Dunya. Thus, saying like you have here, I quote, "Be in the present world as who you are, stranger or a traveler, and count yourself among the inhabitants of the grave," are well attested in early books of Zuhd. Some Sufis pointed to the stark difference between Zuhd and Sufi portrayals of the figure of the stranger by pointing out that, quote, the renouncer, al-Zahid, is a stranger in the present world, while the knower, that is the Sufi, is a stranger in the next world. So this is a wonderful saying that actually in one short sentence encompasses all the difference between Zuhd and Sufism. While Ibn Paqūda's overall treatment of the notion of estrangement and the figure of the stranger in Al-Hidayah includes some Neoplatonic elements, the central discussion he devotes to this topic in the first aspect of self-reckoning falls quite comfortably within the Zuhd framework. A 10th century monograph dedicated to this topic is entitled The Book of the Strangers, Kitab al-Ghuraba. In this work, which is comprised mainly by Zuhd tradition, the author Abu Bakr al-Ajuri speaks about the strangers of our time as the ones who avoid exposing their estrangement towards the present world to other people. So you have here a quote from a Ajuri work. "The strangers of our time, al-Ghuraba fi waqtina, are those who follow the Sunnah and are patient with it. Their request from the world is one which is sufficient for them, and they leave the excess that makes them arrogant, and they are accommodating to the people of their time and do not flatter them, and they are patient with that. Following this path, Ibn Paqūda portrays this situation of estrangement and the figure of the stranger as the summation of the type of Zuhd favored by him, the inward type. Thus, while the believer as a stranger is connected with other people and the affairs of the present world in the outward dimension of his existence, he is completely detached and alienated from them in his inward dimension. Those acts of detachment and alienations are necessary for him to clear his inner space from worldly relations and make it available only for the relations that matter the most, the intimate relation with God. As Ibn Paqūda put it, and here is the quote: "Take upon yourself, O my brother, the obligation of one who is a stranger in the present world, since you really are a stranger in it, lowly and isolated, one who does not have any intimate friend but the Lord. In short, take upon yourself the conditions of the strangers which I have stressed to you here, as long as you live in the present world, for this is the way you will arrive at the bliss of the next world." So this is just abbreviated quote from a much longer discussion. The detailed presentation of the concept of the stranger offered by Ibn Paqūda in the 30th aspect of the self-reckoning is daring and provocative. It emphasized the elements of the believer's loneliness and alienation towards his society and human society in general, his Jewish society in this example, and reveals the raison d'être of private religion. It enables us to understand that although remaining hidden, Zuhd inward type represent a way of renunciation of the present world, which is not easier and no less extreme than the way of the outward type. Remember the difference between extreme and mild asceticism, which when we are coming to Ibn Paqūda, I think become irrelevant altogether. But whereas the outward renunciation of the hardship lies on the extreme physical measures one takes upon himself, in the case of the inward renunciation, the hardship is fundamentally a psychological one. In conclusion of this part, it should be noted that Ibn Paqūda addressed Zuhd in a direct manner and offers several definitions of it, as well as illuminating insights about it in such as the ones discussed above. Nothing of this sort can be found in his work regarding Sufism. Ibn Paqūda never addressed Sufism directly and declined from offering insight about it. So at last we are reaching the Andalusi context. What? Turning now to the Andalusi context of Al-Hidayah, my claim that Zuhd played much more important role than Sufism at the basis of Ibn Paqūda's work is substantiated by the following three types of evidence. The information we have regarding the documentation of Zuhd and Sufi works in al-Andalus up to Ibn Paqūda's time, that is the second half of the 11th century. The understanding that the development of the Western Andalusi mysticism between the 4th and the 6th Hijri centuries, that is between the 10th and the 12th century AD, should not be reduced to the Eastern Sufi type of mysticism. And the specific evidence stemming from the work of Ibn Khamis, a Muslim writer who was Ibn Paqūda's contemporary. Okay, the first point of the documentation. The database project directed by Maribel Fierro, History of Authors and Transmitters of Al-Andalus, is very helpful in this respect. With its help, we can see that up to the time Al-Hidayah was written, that is the later part of the period of the Party Kings, second half of the 11th century, the availability of Zuhd literature of all sorts was significantly higher than that of Sufi literature. This includes some of the early books of Zuhd, quite many of Ibn Abi Adunya's Zuhd monographs, and some of Al-Muhasibi's works, including Ar-Ri'aya li Hukuk Allah. We also have evidence concerning Zuhd works that were written by Andalusi authors. Notably among them is Ibn Abi Zamanin, who wrote Zuhd works such as Hayat al-Qulub. Unfortunately, most of those works are not available to us, at least presently. As shown, for example, in studies by Manuela Marin, Zuhd, you can see the names of some of the studies that were published in Spanish and in English in the 90s. Zuhd in al-Andalus obtained a long and notable presence, not only in the form of literary legacy, but also in the form of living legacy. One of the main features of the Zuhd in al-Andalus before and during Ibn Paqūda's lifetime was withdrawing from public life in Kibad. This practice corresponds roughly with Ibn Paqūda's second category of authentic Zuhd presented above. Turning to Sufism, the above mentioned database revealed that up to Ibn Paqūda's time of activity, the availability of Sufi works in al-Andalus paled in comparison with the availability of works on Zuhd. Up to this time, we lack a concrete information about Sufi works written by Andalusi writers and about the presence of Sufi circles in al-Andalus. It means that Al-Hidayah as a work which includes a wealth of material related to Zuhd and only a little material which can be related specifically to Sufism reflects the state of affairs in al-Andalus during and before the author's time. Now, the second point, the development of Western Andalusian mysticism. Among the scholars of Andalusi culture, it was common to identify mysticism with Sufism, so easy. Thus, at least from the time of Ibn Masara, who died at 931 AD, Andalusi authors and figures who exhibits or reported to exhibit mystical tendencies were considered to be Sufis by those scholars. In recent times, this common scholarly attitude was criticized and challenged most significantly and comprehensively in the two following books: Mysticism and Philosophy in al-Andalus, Ibn Masara and Ibn Arabi, and the Ismaili Tradition by Michael Epstein, and the Mystics of al-Andalus, Ibn Barajan, and the Islamic Thought of the 12th Century by Yusuf Kayswit. Both scholars subscribe to the attitude that the development of Andalusi mysticism between the 10th and the 12th century AD, the role reserved to Sufism was secondary and even marginal one. Andalusi mysticism of that period was shaped mainly by other tendencies such as Neoplatonic philosophy mixed with Shia Ismaili ingredients and occult sciences such as the science of the letters, ilm al-huruf, of the non-Sufi type. Thus, contrary to much of what was written on this topic in the past, and possibly even in the present, Andalusi figures with mystic proclivities should not be regarded as Sufis. From his perspective, Kayswit shows that Andalusi mystics, including Ibn Paqūda's younger contemporary Ibn Barajan, describe themselves as mu'attabirun, that is, the practitioners of the art of contemplation, ittibar, or crossing, ibara. Through the use of this art, its practitioners can cross and elevate themselves from the realm of the visible present world into the unseen higher cosmological and eschatological worlds. Epstein and Kayswit's assertions regarding the characteristics of Andalusi mysticism corroborates with what we find in Al-Hidayah. Ibn Paqūda devotes the second part of his work to the concept of contemplation, ittibar. Within this part, we find an intriguing reference to the important mystical symbol of this concept, the symbol of the ladder, sulam, of ascension. Quote, "The clever and intelligent man should extract from this world the knowledge of its spiritual and subtle and the elements, making them into a ladder of inference on the omnipotent creator." End of quote. In addition, the most elaborate passage Ibn Paqūda devotes to the all-important doctrine from the Islamic mystical perspective of the friendship of God, walaya or wilaya, the use of Ismaili elements is discernible. And a publisher article of mine, which is devoted to this issue, is about to be published very soon. Furthermore, Al-Hidayah contains a handful of detailed descriptions of a mystic nature. In those descriptions, few Sufi elements are traceable, but the Neoplatonic and Zuhd elements are evident even more. Now we move to the last point, the case of Ibn Khamis. The case of Muhammad ibn Khamis al-Yaburi deserves special attention. Qadi Iyad report that Ibn Khamis was a disseminator of al-Muhasibi's writings in al-Andalus, and that he himself studied with him al-Muhasibi major work, Ri'aya li Hukuk Allah. Like Ibn Paqūda, only one work of Ibn Khamis has reached us. This work, titled Kitab al-Gharib al-Muntaka min Kalam Ahl al-Tuqa, the selected wondrous saying of the God-fearing ones. You can see the photo, and I decided not to bring, this book was published in Spain in 2010, and I decided not to show you the misleading heading of, in Spanish of this book, but you can find it maybe in the net if you want. A comparative reading of Ibn Paqūda and Ibn Khamis works reveals that although Ibn Paqūda's work is longer and much more systematic, there are many points of similarity between them. There is no room for me here to get into the thick of this issue. Suffice it to say that it seems that among the works of that era, al-Gharib al-Muntaka is the closest work to al-Hidayah and vice versa. Both works share the special blend in which Zuhd in general and al-Muhasibi's inward type of Zuhd in particular is by far the major component. Philosophy is a secondary component, and Sufism is another secondary component. Like Ibn Paqūda, Ibn Khamis does not offer direct references to Sufism, while offering plenty of direct references to Zuhd. As for the rationalistic philosophical tendencies, its role in al-Hidayah is greater than in al-Gharib al-Muntaka. On the other hand, Sufism plays a greater role in Ibn Khamis's work. Most notably, al-Gharib al-Muntaka includes two short passages. It's one page altogether. In the printed edition, it's 220 pages. But those two short passages are immersed with terminology typical to the kind of Sufism which descended from the principal Baghdadi teacher al-Junaid. Nothing of this sort can be found in al-Hidayah. In conclusion, and this is finally the final conclusion, we see that placing al-Hidayah in its Andalusi context is fruitful and helpful. Along with Ibn Khamis's work, Ibn Paqūda's work stands as a major evidence for the receptions of al-Muhasibi's inward type of Zuhd in al-Andalus. On the same time, in addition with Ibn Khamis's work, as well as with the works by Ibn Barajan and others, al-Hidayah supply us with evidence that by the later part of the 11th and the beginning of the 12th centuries, the reception of Sufism among intellectual Andalusi circle was still in a rather early stage of its development. Thank you very much.